Hey everyone, my name's Chaz Upton. The topic of choice for my youth ethnography was homeschooled students, and specifically I went with the middle school adolescents. The reason for that being that I work with my church's middle school ministries, so access to the middle school homeschoolers was a lot easier. Now, it's also worth mentioning that I chose middle school homeschoolers because in Montana, where I live, there's a great lack of diversity here when it comes to specific cultures. It is worth saying that their culture is growing and there are more and more cultures coming into the state, but at this point, the state is still greatly lacking in culture. So finding a culture that would fit this group study was a lot harder to do because there just was not enough students that would fit other cultures. And so homeschooled students became a great choice of mine. The homeschool students that I focused on were five students, three of them females and two of them males. I had one from each grade except for sixth grade for males because we didn't have a consistent homeschool student attending as a sixth grade student. Now, of these five students that I chose, two of them were siblings, and one of them was actually currently a public schooler, but he was raised in homeschooling. And so I thought that would be a very interesting take to see how he may be different than his homeschool peers, despite originally being homeschooled himself. Now, a lot of the reasoning I chose homeschooling was because, first off, homeschooling is growing immensely. Around the turn of the century, there was probably about 700,000 students being homeschooled. But within the last school year, the 2020-2021 school year, the amount of homeschoolers was somewhere around 3.7 million students. Now, a lot of that is largely due to the global pandemic that went through, but because of that, homeschooling not only got kickstarted, but it's also still growing for a variety of reasons. And so the more homeschoolers there are, the bigger the need it is for ministers to know how to reach them. Another reason I chose homeschoolers because there are a lot of stereotypes about homeschool students. Some of those include they don't have socialization skills. They are not good at relating to their peers. They're not good at relating to people around them very well. Another stereotype is that they're overly sheltered. They don't have the pressures and the responsibilities of the outside world. They're not connected to the outside cultures, whether that be politically or whether that be community service or volunteer work. They're just overly sheltered from pressures and from the dark sides of this world. There's also stereotypes about them being lower in intellect. And there's also just a stereotype that when it comes to homeschoolers, they're pretty much all entirely Protestant, white, and middle class families. Now, all these stereotypes are likely based on some form of truth, but it's important to recognize that some stereotypes may be pretty well true, and other stereotypes might not be even remotely true anymore. And the last reason I chose them is because within my personal church, there's a very decently sized population of homeschoolers. And so if I am going to be working in this ministry, I feel it is very important to be able to know how to connect with these students. So when it came to studying these students, I chose two main methods. The first method was a personal interview. I sat down each student individually and I interviewed them. And I asked them a lot of questions about homeschooling, about their families, about themselves, about their peers, and I just wanted to get to know who they were. These interviews were conducted before and after the youth group so that it could be done privately and I could have individual time with each of them. Now, I obviously connected with every student's parent to make sure that I could indeed have their permission to do this. So after I gained their permission, that is when I went through this process. Now, these interviews took 3 weeks to finish up. And in those 3 weeks, I also spent the majority of time at youth group observing these students. This was done covertly, which means I wasn't interacting with the students. They knew that I was there and they knew that I was sort of watching them interact, but because I wasn't interacting with them specifically about this, most of the time they forgot that they were even being watched for this process. So it was done from a mostly covert standpoint. Over the 3 weeks, I watched and observed and took meticulous notes of all the students and their interactions with peers, with authority figures, with the games, activities. And this was done before youth group started, during the youth group event itself, and even after youth group concluded. Now, overall, there was a lot of different findings of the study. So first off, I want to start with what I discovered in the interviews themselves. Now, the performance of all 5 students was honestly really well done. Of the 5 students, only one of the girls was really apprehensive at first about being interviewed. When I first asked her about being interviewed, she was very uncertain about that, but I convinced her that I was just going to ask her about homeschooling, and she really warmed up quickly. The other 4 students were really not too concerned about it, and one of the male students was even just overly enthusiastic about being interviewed at all. Now, one of the main questions I asked all 5 students was, did they know of any stereotypes about being homeschooled? And to my surprise, out of the 5 students, only 2 of them ever actually knew that there were stereotypes of being homeschooled. The other 3 students kind of looked at me confused and said, no, I don't think I've heard of stereotypes about homeschoolers. The other 2 who did hear of stereotypes, they mentioned the most common one being that homeschoolers are socially awkward, that they don't have a lot of socialization skills. After that, I asked them a lot about their homeschooling. I asked what they liked and what they didn't like, what were some challenges of it. And for the most part, they all agreed that they liked homeschooling. All 5 of them really enjoyed being homeschooled and would not have changed it. Even the student who is currently public schooled, he said that he did enjoy being homeschooled when he was in it. A lot of the reasons that they liked homeschool was because it gave them a lot of freedom. It was very comfortable. There was a lot of tailored learning to their learning ability. But the most important like that they had about homeschooling was that it was able to include faith-based learning within their homeschooling. It wasn't regulated. Their parents, who all 5 of them have good Christian parents, were able to understand about the faith aspect of their life, and it was included in their studies. Now, when I asked them about dislikes, most of them had the same sort of dislike. A lot of them mentioned that being homeschooled doesn't really present a lot of opportunity to meet other students or meet other kids. They didn't mention that it was necessarily hard to make friends out there. The hard part was just the opportunity to make friends. And so from their perspective, when it came to being homeschooled, the issue was more of not really seeing other students as opposed to being not good at making friends with other students. Now, it is worth mentioning that all 5 students are very active in outside of their schooling. One student was involved in dance, another student was involved in theater, a third was involved in sports, and the other 2 students, though they're not really involved in a lot of community things like that, they are heavily involved in the church. And so they do a lot of things with church programs, organizations, and events. Now, personality-wise, these students, as far as the females go, the females were pretty similar. The 8th grade girl was probably the most extroverted and friendly, and as far as the interview went, whereas the 6th grade girl and 7th grade girl were a little bit more passive and a little bit more soft. The boys, on the other hand, were a little bit different. What's interesting is the 6th grade girl was very quiet and shy, but her brother, which was the 8th grade boy, he was very sociable, very easy to talk to. You could tell that he was extremely mature for his age. And the 7th grade boy was just excited to be interviewed. He had a great time overall and was not uncomfortable at all. Now, the most important question I believe I asked the students in the interview was, once I got to know their personalities, I specifically asked each one, do you think that your personality is influenced by being homeschooled? And all 5 of them, even though these interviews were done individually, all 5 of them agreed that homeschooling really didn't play a part in developing their personality. Which was fascinating because a lot of the stereotypes assume that because you're homeschooled, you're automatically going to be awkward or socially uncomfortable. But all 5 students agreed that they had more in touch with their parents and their upbringing that would develop their personality on top of a lot of them just mentioned that some of them acknowledged being awkward, some of them acknowledged being wild and goofy, but most of them just said that whoever they are is just how God made them. Their schooling had nothing to do with it, and being kept at home for school was not part of the reason for who they were. It was just the way God had made them. Now, the interviews were fascinating, and I did take a lot away from that. But I did remind myself that just because a student says something doesn't mean that's necessarily what they believe. And so I had to take what I learned in the interviews and apply it to what I observed from them. So I observed a lot of their interactions with each other, and a lot of that came down to how they talked and how they acted towards everything they encountered. So first off, the students, their words that they used for each other. All five homeschoolers in this study really had very friendly language. None of them were typically using the hip lingo or whatever you want to call it that typical teenagers might use. They were very soft spoken, but not in a passive way, just in a very friendly, easygoing way. Some of the girls were a little bit quieter, so they weren't as talkative towards their peers, towards their friends, but the boys were both very extroverted and very friendly. There really was no crude humor, there wasn't any offensive language or any disrespect towards authority figures. They were overall very solid in their vocabulary. Now, as far as the extroversion versus introversion scale, the girls, as I said, were very much more introverted than the boys. The girls typically hung out with small groups of friends. They kept to themselves more, and they weren't necessarily the most boisterous. They didn't necessarily go and seek other people out. They kind of just fell into their comfort zone with their comfortable friends, and they kind of stayed there for most of the night. The boys, on the other hand, were much more so the extroverted ones. They would typically include others, bring them into things. They would seek other people out and have conversations instead of waiting for others to come to them. The seventh grade boy even was good at talking to females, males, sixth grade through eighth grade. He talked to everybody he could, even authority figures. And that was impressive compared to just taking the whole population of the youth group into scale, because not everybody does that. And so him being homeschooled and the eighth grade boy being homeschooled and them doing that was remarkable, because the other kids at the group who aren't all homeschooled, not even they were doing a lot of those things. Now, when it came to friend groups, as I mentioned, the girls were more so confined to their specific friend group. And their friend group really consisted of the people that they were the most similar to. Over the months of being in youth group, they would typically find the friends, the people that were closest to them in personality, and they would stick with them. Now, that doesn't mean that they were rude towards others or very, very unfriendly to them, but they definitely did not seek other people out or try and include more people in their group in a passionate way. They just were very comfortable with where they were at. And the boys were similar. While they were extroverted and while they did seek others out, their friend groups were pretty similar to who they were. Now, the eighth grade boy did struggle to really fit in super well. He's very, very mature for his age. And so that part struggled because his eighth grade peers, they're not quite mature yet. And so they're still sort of disrespectful, disobedient. They don't always have the nicest language. There's more teasing, whereas he was much more mature in his words, his actions. So even though he spent time with them, he definitely, you could tell he wanted to fit in, but he wasn't quite there. And lastly, as far as participation goes, I just watched all five students as the night went on. This included just pre-youth group basketball game, the games and activities in youth group, the worship, the sermon, and the small group time. And really, all five of them participated in some manner. The girls were more so going to hang back. The seventh grade girl was probably the most passive as far as participation goes. And it wasn't in a disrespectful way. It was just in a way of not wanting to be embarrassed by some of the goofy games that were done. Whereas the boys, They didn't really care if they looked embarrassed or goofy. They just kind of went for it, even if they weren't that good at whatever was being done. As far as the sermon and worship and small group time, most of them participated in a respectful manner. They listened, they sang along. In small group time, the boys were more likely to participate and ask questions and answer questions, whereas the girls just kind of sat there and listened quietly as their peers talked and discussed. So these findings really put together an overarching concept for me as I compared the stereotypes with what is truly I'm witnessing here. And what I found was that there were two main solutions to meeting the needs of students. Because I personally believe that being homeschooled is not the main factor behind how a homeschool student acts. I believe that there is more to it than just being homeschooled. I think the most crucial piece of a homeschool student being quote unquote socially awkward or not have possessing social skills, I think that relies more on the parental upbringing than the homeschooling itself. And I realized this because as I looked at the parents and the background of these students, I recognized that the girls who were the seventh grade girl who is extremely quiet, her parents are both very passive, very soft spoken people. Whereas the seventh grade boy who is boisterous and crazy and wild, he comes from an extremely extroverted family. The siblings, the sixth grade girl and eighth grade boy who are siblings, were more passive and a little more socially awkward, their parents don't really let them get out much, and so they don't really get to use those skills. Now, of course, they're homeschooled, but there's more to it than just being homeschooled. The other students have activities outside of their homeschooling that helps them meet students. And those students don't really have those opportunities. And so that gives us two main solutions to how we can interact with homeschoolers effectively. The first one is this: you have to know their background. You got to know their background. And a large part of that is get to know the parents and the parental influence. What is the personality of the parents? How are they involved in their students' lives? Are they participating a lot? Are they doing a lot? Because their parents are going to impact them greatly. The students are really going to exemplify the parents that raised them, especially through homeschool because they spend more time with their parents. So once you get to know their parents, you can attribute the actions and the words of students more so to what their upbringing is than to just labeling them as an awkward homeschooler and moving on. The other key piece of treating homeschoolers well is to treat them equally. A lot of times we, as leaders, might look at students and acknowledge that they are homeschooled and sort of give them that negative connotation of being a homeschooler, and that's why they're awkward. But when we do that, we only reinforce the stereotypes that a lot of them are hearing. So we have to be careful to not acknowledge homeschoolers in a negative way. You can by all means ask students, oh, you're homeschooled, what's that like? Get to know them more. But don't just automatically treat them like they're socially awkward or they're lower in intellect, because that's going to reinforce stereotypes that are already running rampant. The other thing is to really treat them equally compared to their peers. Don't treat them differently. Don't use different words or different language or give them different tasks than others. Give them the same amount of love that they deserve and grace when they mess up. If you can treat them just like their peers, those stereotypes that are telling them that they're different will start to fade away because they suddenly realize that no, they are in fact just as valuable and just as loved as their public school and private school peers. And so to summarize, homeschool population is growing. There are a lot of homeschoolers that are becoming homeschooled based on a variety of reasons. And so we can't ignore that the homeschool population is growing. But at the same time, stereotypes of homeschoolers are rampant. They're everywhere. And a lot of them just do not seem to really fit the bill. They do not seem to be accurate. And so we have to be careful of managing those stereotypes because homeschoolers, they just need Jesus like any other student in your ministry. And so the best way to bring Jesus to them is to first know their background and know their parents. Know who they spend time with at home and how that might be influencing them. But then just treat them equally. Just don't even acknowledge in your mind that they're homeschooled. Just love them like you would love any other student in your ministry. Be patient with them and show them grace. And if they are socially awkward, if they are more sheltered, give them experience to get out there. Encourage them to meet other students and to get involved, to give them more opportunities to explore their socialization skills. Because all these students need Jesus, and so we can't just label them as a homeschooler and then move on and expect them to figure it out. We have to step up as youth leaders and we have to help them and love on them just like we would help and love any other student in our ministry.